welcome to tonight's event. This is the last online event in connection with the Oscar Marzaroli exhibition that finishes tomorrow. We've had a number of live streams of late just to focus back in on the exhibition itself. This event this evening, Oscar and Me, was actually scheduled to take place earlier in the year in March, just before lockdown had us in its grip. So we thought we would revisit that and just do it online in the evening before the exhibition finishes. The exhibition finishes, but it's not the end, because it's just the end of the run of one particular exhibition. Of course, back in March, we couldn't have foreseen really what was ahead of us in terms of 2020 was going to bring for us. Lots has happened, you know, during that lockdown period and episode of COVID. And despite all the tumult, you know, some remarkable things have taken place, and art and culture is very much a part of that, because that is what binds us all together, and providing a space of affirmation, for respite, revelation, dreaming, and opposition, but an affirmation mostly. So tonight's event, we're going to hear some commentary and anecdotes from a range of people. Most knew Oscar Marzaroli in person, others had some kind of encounter indeed with his legacy. Everyone who's speaking are more or less movers and shakers in their own fields, all of which are cultural. So rather than introducing everybody individually, I'm going to ask them all to switch your video back on.
I can't, because you've stopped it.
So welcome everyone. All looking well? Yes. I'm glad to see no Christmas jumpers. That's good.
I've got mine underneath this.
Yeah. So Alistair's still not there on video yet, but he will join us. He will join us in a bit. So I just thought I would let you see the faces of most of the contributors this evening. We have Jennie Renton, David Bruce, Norrie Wilson, Paddy Higson, Alan Crumlish, Chris Leslie, Alistair McCallum, and also some special contributions from Oscar's grandchildren, which we'll hear from in a minute, in actual fact. So I'll say hello to you all again and give you a very brief introduction when it comes to your turn, folks, if that's okay. So can I now ask you just switch your video back off, and I will go into the PowerPoint here. Just to remind everyone what the exhibition looks like for those unfortunate people who might not have got to see it. A fantastic exhibition. It's first exhibition, of course, that's run from one Christmas to the next Christmas, funnily enough, but during the course of that year, it was suspended because of the COVID situation. So there are some of Oscar's cameras that we had to put into safe storage when we did go into lockdown, just for security reasons. So I think first up is Oscar's grandchildren. So Lewis and Liam and Rachel and Natal are just going to say a few words here, and then we'll get underway with the other presentations.
Hi everyone, it's Liam and Lewis here, Oscar's grandchildren. We just wanted to record a short video saying how amazing it was to see Oscar's work showcased at street level.
Yeah, although we never met our grandfather Oscar, he's still deeply close to us through his personal photographs of Glasgow and the Gorbals, and the way he showcased these communities is truly magical, and that's why Oscar's legacy means so much to me and Liam. To not only keep Oscar alive and to continue his legacy, but to keep the people in these communities alive as well.
Yeah, we're so excited for everyone to see the new photographs coming out from the archive at Glasgow Caledonian University too, and to see the stories that Oscar wanted to show for his pictures.
And so they've never been seen before as well, so it'll be exciting to see that.
Yeah, it'll be exciting for us too.
Yeah, and also thank you to Malcolm and everyone at street level.
Photographs coming out from the, yeah, thank you. It was an amazing experience. Yeah. We're so glad that it was made possible. Yeah. So
yeah. Thank you everyone.
Thank you everyone.
Stay safe.
If you remember ever having a moment where you saw an image and thought that's my absolute favourite, because I don't remember when that happened, but I feel like we both have a kind of idea of what our favourites are. What one's your favourite?
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, I feel like I have a couple. Yeah. One of my favourite images is, I think it's called Last One Standing, but I'm quite bad with all the names, so I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of, an image of a tenement building, and it's the last building in the row, and everything else around it has been demolished, and there's a high-rise building in the background. And it's funny because I think the appreciation for that is now I actually stay in a tenement flat. And I've watched so many documentaries and stuff on Glasgow and the tenement buildings and the area that I stay in. The people here fought so hard to keep the tenement buildings here, because the flat that I'm actually living in was meant to be knocked down.
All right.
So the people that lived in our area fought to keep all the tenement buildings here, and I think it just shows that the community as well, just the buildings here have so much history, and I think, as I said, you can't really appreciate these things until you get a bit older, but now here I am in a tenement building, and I know Grandpa used to always say that an image can say 1,000 words. I know he was mostly a filmmaker, but I think he loved his camera, and I think when you see that image, you don't even really need a description as to what it says and what it means. And
but that's crazy, isn't it? That you can look at that was taken, decades ago, and you can relate to it, even though it's not how it is now. It's really, really crazy.
Yeah. As I said, one image like that I can look at now, even as not his granddaughter, it's still something that I can relate to.
You can appreciate,
Yeah,
I think that's what's been nice as well, is growing up and being part of, this side of things, and understanding that it is acknowledged outside our family, and that, people see his work, and that, because obviously growing up, that just wasn't something that we could fathom. So I think it's quite nice that we've been able to kind of grow up and be part of that world where, Mum is creating everything and what she put together, and how all of that would work to share that with other people.
Obviously grew up around a lot of the images that you maybe don't see. And I think that was a lovely thing about the exhibition as well, was the cabinets that had all of the personal photos.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of those photos are maybe photos that people have never seen before, but pictures that have been in our family and are so, you know, that was maybe pictures that we related to more as children, because that was photographs of our mum and our aunties as young children, and obviously our gran and our grandpa. And family photos where, you know, I know there's not a lot of pictures of our grandpa, and he was quite camera shy, but those images mean so much to us as a family. And I think being able to see that and to be able to share that to everyone else as well, that was something that I didn't even realise we were going to see in the exhibition. So that was a really surprise. And all of the newspaper clippings that my gran had collected over the years, you know, it's all of our kind of really personal things, like even his camera, you know, things that it's kind of bad to say, but me and my sisters used to play with when we were younger, and we were not realising the value or what it actually was. But these are all things that have really been in our family and are just part of our, you know, part of everything that we really are, is like the Marzoli family. And it's just kind of nice. It was really lovely to be able to see that. You know,
and it was amazing to see, to almost feel that with complete strangers, for people to see the same images we've seen, and to almost feel that same connection to this man, and so many people who knew him, and of course we never did really. So it's amazing to even speak to those people that are still here and can share those, because then you feel like you kind of get to know him even more in a different way, just by all these different stories and people who were there, and it's just it's amazing to feel like you've got this weird connection with all of these people because of all these images and this the person obviously that took them. And
well, that conversation between Rachel and Natalie was from a longer discourse that they had, but we've just selected a section of that. Hopefully we'll be able to put that up on our website at some point. So thanks to the both of you, and to Liam and Lewis. I just thought that, or we just thought that was a very good starting point, because when we reopened in September, we did notice, you know, a much larger number of younger people coming to see the exhibition, and that's always quite kind of curious about how people connect to the work, and of a time that they never experienced. It's, you know, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think a lot of the testimonies and the comments that have happened along the way give further testimony to that. So I'm going to go back into the PowerPoint again here, and mention Lewis and Liam mentioned the GCU Archive, which is host to the Oscar Marzaroli collection. So the family did gift the whole archive to the GCU, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. And I can't think where else it would rather go, to be honest, given their focus on the social history of Glasgow. So it will take a little bit of time to further, you know, scan the rest of all that work in. There's about 50,000 negatives, at least, in that whole collection, but things are underway. This is Carol. Carol can't join us tonight. There was a miscommunication on my part with the dates, but she has a kind of get together this evening anyway. But Carol's been tremendously helpful in partnering with us in making this exhibition happen, in terms of accessing the images that we selected from those 50,000 negatives with such speed and dedication. So it couldn't really have happened otherwise, or it certainly couldn't have happened last year or next year without a lot more work being done. So hats off to Carol, to Simon, and everyone at Glasgow Caledonian Uni. Now I'm going to just read a little excerpt from Carol, if you can bear with me on this. It's very special to be custodians of Oscar Marzaroli's complete works. I believe first and foremost our job is to take this privilege impart his vision to as many people as possible. I'm not an expert on the life and works of Oscar, although I am delighted to be expanding my knowledge weekly. Like many Glaswegians born in the early 1960s, I just knew of Oscar's photographs. He's part of our heritage. What I can bring to this wonderful visual party is the knowledge of preservation, cataloguing and digitisation. And that is exactly where we intend to do at Glasgow Caledonian University Archive Centre. This has only been made possible through the big hearts of his three daughters, Marie Claire, Nicola and Lisa, made special by their friendship and shared stories. At the end of the day, archives are extraordinary stories of ordinary people, and this archive is the story of one extraordinary photographer who in turn has captured the stories of numerous people and places. As archivists, we aim to preserve the past to inform the present and the future. Documenting a moment in time, Oscar has left a visible feast for us to make available for all to enjoy. The photograph as an archival resource can be used not only for learning, teaching and research, but to inspire and create a sense of community. Our collaboration with Street Level in delivering their hugely successful Marzoli exhibition is a wonderful example of this. So with approximately 50,000 negatives to share, we're excited to see how Marzaroli's vision is perceived and used in the 21st century. So Glasgow Caledonian University are currently fundraising in order to make that happen, and I suppose to take care of the archive and that work for many, many years to come. So moving on, this is Nicola and Marie Claire, two of Oscar's daughters. There's three daughters, the other is Lisa Jane, and we'll see her very shortly. This was at the launch of the Marzaroli collection at GCU, and thanks to GCU for sharing that image with us. At the reception that we had for the opening of the show, which was 1 year ago in actual fact, and it's the first time that I got to meet photographer Alan Crumlish, who's been a practicing photographer for over 30 years, 35 now, maybe Alan, maybe 40. So it was wonderful to meet you, and that's you with Marie Claire here. Could I ask you to come on screen now, Alan?
Okay, should be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got you now.
Got me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Would that be right? 30 years, 35 years?
About 40 now, Malcolm.
40, yeah.
Yeah, originally I studied, which is actually, I'll come on to, is how I got to know Oscar. I studied and qualified as an architect. I was very frustrated by all the high-rise stuff and everything that's going on. I was looking for getting clothes. Photography seemed to suit me better, so I actively started working as a photographer in the early 80s.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. And you're in Hoyk at the moment.
Sorry?
You're in Hoyk at the moment.
Where people are. 6 years ago, Glasgow was great for me, but I just wanted to change of life, something quieter. Came back to renovate an old house, and I spent some time in my own archive, really. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of gems within that. Now, this image here, as the credit says, was at the launch of Songs for Oscar.
Yeah.
Tell us about this image, Alan.
Right. I mean, this was one of the major events. I was quite flattered after Oscar died to be asked onto the Trust as the only photographer. And the Trust was struggling a wee bit. Its main game was to do what you and Caledonian have finally done, which is to find a home for the negatives and consolidate and put forward Oscar's legacy for all to see. And in the course of that, Ricky Ross, who was also on the Trust with Jim Grassi and a number of other people, I had this initiative to put together an album of songs dedicated to Oscar. Ricky, of course, had used one of Oscar's pictures on the cover of Raintown, and he managed to persuade Pat Kane and Ricky and Marty Pello also to participate in that, which was quite an achievement because the three of them were at the top of their game. And to say they were rivals is possibly understating it slightly. So to get them all in the one room was quite something. And to be honest, to get that picture, it took about 15 minutes to actually persuade them to all get together with Anne and Marie Claire. But it was a great day. They turned out, and I was very privileged to get a fly in the wall of some of the goings on, and not least of all to hear their sound sets before the evening, you know, and hearing Marty Pello sing a cappella, if anybody told you he couldn't sing, you know, was quite something. This Pat Kane talking to Annie's wife, quite relaxed, and Lisa, who I've got back in contact with again recently. But, you know, by and large, it was a pretty good day. Yeah.
I like this one, Alan.
Yeah.
I would say for people who are watching tonight, I think guess the caption competition.
We got like that. I mean, Lisa actually said, strangely, I didn't actually remember printing this. Lisa had actually said when she saw the earlier picture, it was the one she loved of her mum, just on cloud nine, between Pat Kane and Marty there. So I went back, found it out. A good reason to go back into the archive, scan some more, sent them on. But that's just Anne. She was lovely. I mean, completely relaxed individual. You know, have her moments, but most of the time, you know, just enjoyed life, you know.
And this one,
this was, I was working as a photographer for Glasgow 1990. And as one of the events, Richard Attenborough came to Glasgow for the European Film Awards, which were held there that year, and went to Kelvin Grove, largely to see, you know, the Dali, which everyone does, but then spent a massive amount of time looking at this exhibition, which was the posthumous exhibition that Anne had mounted after Oscar died. And I managed to persuade him to stand and have his picture taken beside this poster. It was a small way of trying to increase the coverage of Oscar, and, you know, using the old trick of a celebrity to hang it on, you know, so it was just an opportunity to grab.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great to see this because importantly, it was in 1990 and it was a big exhibition.
Yeah. And Oscar had that exhibition. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that was the last time his works were publicly seen until they've been seen in street level.
Well, in a big exhibition.
And, you know, I mean, having worked on the Trust with all the difficulties of trying to find, you know, and dead ends like the Mitchell Library, trying to find places to lodge the archive, it's just wonderful to see that it's now with Caledonian University and that you at street level have given it the exposure that it deserves. Long overdue, 30 years in coming, you know.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of people being involved in that, Alan.
Yeah.
And, everyone is a part of that.
Yeah,
So,
and it's worth saying about Laughlin's printing. You know, I printed a lot of the pictures with Marie Claire for the posthumous book, Glasgow's People, and know that it wasn't necessarily easy to relate, not to relate to the negatives, but, you know, the exposures could vary widely. It was a bit of work sometimes. And I had the advantage, it was one of the things that Oscar introduced me to, which was AGFA photographic paper. You know, I was stumbling with Kodak and he told me to go to Williamson and Wolf's in Sucky Hall Street and get AGFA paper, and I never looked back. I used it for 30 odd years. So it had a particular quality in the prints that was lost in Ilford and Kodak, and, you know, Oscar related to that. But, you know, I can't compliment Laughlin enough on the way that he has so sympathetically interpreted those prints, you know. Great.
Yeah. It was a long process to go through to compare with earlier prints. And again, there was other people involved in that as well, Alan, but yeah, Lachlan did a great job. So I think we'll leave it there at the moment. Thank you for that contribution. We'll hear from you very shortly when everyone else has contributed. John will share the link to your website if that is okay.
That's fine, yeah.
So if you'd like to stop your video again. Oh, I beg your pardon. I'm very sorry. I've got one more here. One more. Just very briefly, this is
Marie Claire's wedding. Obviously, Oscar wasn't there to photograph it. There was an official photographer, but following his funeral, which is for another time, and never go anywhere without a camera, I took a camera along, and just after the ceremony, while the photographer was doing the setups, I was at the back of the church, and something caught Marie Claire and Martin's attention on the gallery above my head, and I just one-off snap, and I just thought, you know, like that.
Thanks. Well, we kept that in because we'd like to wish Marie Claire and Martin all the best. They've been in certain COVID circumstances, so hopefully for a full recovery of all there. So thank you, Alan.
Okay.
We'll hear from you again shortly if you switch your video off. And Paddy, would you like to reveal yourself? Now, this is an image of Bill Forsyth and Claire Grogan. Now, Paddy Higson is not directly connected to this, but she is to film.
Malcolm, I was. That was on
Oh,
Comfort
I beg your pardon.
That was Comfort and Joy.
Tell us.
No, that was I think probably somewhere up above Mary Hill, just before the ice cream van got vandalised. Yeah, so it was on Comfort and Joy. So I was there at that time.
Well, I must apologise about that because
all right.
I thought in our early correspondence I thought otherwise. But anyway, you're very much involved in film, or you were involved and still are, but you're also currently Chief Executive of GMAC, Glasgow Media Access Centre, which is a neighbour of ours in this cultural hub we call Trongate 103. But yeah, that features Bill Forsyth, and those who watched the streaming of the films on Thursday and seen Chris Leslie's Reimagining Glasgow would have seen excerpts from Glasgow 1980 film that Oscar Marzaroli did. Bill Forsyth, as a younger guy, then edited that film, in actual fact, so that's the connection there. So here you are, Paddy, in 1983, again with Claire Grogan, who actress but also a singer with Altered Images, of course. We've had a little chat about that. We're not quite sure where it is, but it might be the GFD launch of something.
I think it probably is.
Yeah. But what's your connection to Oscar there?
Well, I started out, I think Oscar actually gave me my first ever production management credit on a short film that I think was from, originally it was Films of Scotland and the Highlands and Islands Development Board, as it was called then. It was called Highlands and Islands, a Royal Tour, which sounds incredibly dull. But Charlie Gormley was the producer, Oscar was the director, and it was filmed, I think, over about a week while Prince Charles was supposedly visiting the new kind of industrial Highlands and Islands that was trying to be built at the time. He was riding around in his own helicopter, which he was piloting, and we had a helicopter piloted by John Poland, who was a legendary film pilot. And we also had a Loganair charter plane, and we sort of leapfrogged each other from one place to another. And in truth, I'd totally forgotten about this film until you asked me to do this, Malcolm. So I got it out of the Moving Image Archive and watched it again because I couldn't remember when I'd been in Lewis with Oscar. There were lots of bits of wonderful scenery because it was shot by two of the very, very fine cinematographers, Marty Singleton and David Peat. Louis Kramer was doing sound and Ian Leslie was also doing sound. And both of them always seem to manage to get into shot. I don't know what it is with sound guys. They always seem to be able to do that somehow. I remember Oscar telling us tales about Lewis. He loved Lewis. He always was keen to go back. And he told a story about shooting a film years and years before where he'd been told that he must not shoot on a Sunday, but he wanted to capture shots of the Lewis people going into one of the churches. So he set up his camera and tried to be discreet. The notion of Oscar being discreet anywhere is actually quite strange because you couldn't miss him really. Anyway, an old lady came along and cursed him, and he used to swear blind that he wasn't anywhere near the tripod, and it just fell over, and the magazine broke open, and all the film was wasted. So he really felt this very strongly. On the Friday, the other thing I remember mostly about him is meeting him. You know, the entire film community, along with the architectural community, strangely enough, Alan, used to meet up in the Halt Bar on a Friday evening. So they all seemed to get on incredibly well together. So you'd have Peter McGurn and Andy McMillan and Izzy Metstein and Charlie Gormley and Mike Alexander and Mark Littlewood and everybody. And Oscar was always part of that. And I think part of the thing that he liked about being involved in film rather than in stills photography is that there was a great camaraderie that existed within the filmmaking community. And that's something that he really did enjoy. The other thing I remember particularly about him is how much he adored his family. He used to talk about the bread snappers, and he used to accuse me of, well, I would have parked mine in the car outside the Halt Bar for when I nipped in for a half pint. And Oscar would come in and demand to know why you'd left the bread snapper sitting out in the car. You wouldn't be allowed to do that nowadays, I don't think, or else you'd be lifted and so would they. Anyway, that's kind of a bit of my memories of Oscar.
Well, thank you very much. That's great. Great. Thank you, Paddy. And it was only a half pint, of course, wasn't it?
Of course. I still had to drive right out to Torrance after that. Yeah. So I wasn't going to do too much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, interestingly, you mentioned David Peat there, Martin Singleton, and that's a good segue to ask David to switch his video on. So if you could put yours back off again, Paddy, thank you.
Will do.
So David?
Yeah, that's Mickey Coulter, who went on to great things in Hollywood and elsewhere, and Oscar, and David Peat, the late David Peat. I don't know what the occasion was that should have brought three cameramen all together, but it's a great picky.
Yeah, it is indeed. And I see that Oscar has a stills camera around his neck.
Of course, aye.
Always out on location, he would have a camera with him, I do believe.
Absolutely, that's it.
But, yeah, just a little footnote though, David, you were very much involved with us back in 2012 when we did the David Peat retrospective. In actual fact, yourself and Trish, David Widow, were very much involved in that. So yeah, you know, you're something of a legend in terms of your film and photographic historian credentials, are you not?
Goodness me, a legend. I've never been called that. I've been called many a thing in my time, but legend, I think that's the first time welcome. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
You know what, my recollections of Oscar are pretty strong. I mean, essentially the first thing you remember about him was this big, slightly shambolic guy whose way of greeting friends was to grab them by the earlobe. It's just, I don't know if you could get off of that these days, but you know, he always came up and said, how's your lobes? And the net result is that you become very fond of him. Affection is the word that comes to mind. In fact, just a few minutes ago, I was picking up Shades of Grey, and there it was, and he very kindly signed a copy for me. And in it, you won't be able to read it, that the word affection was directed by Oscar to me. And that I find very touching. And I must confess, until just a few minutes ago, I'd completely forgotten about that. But the other thing about Oscar, apart from the kind of personal thing, is of course the work. And you know, not just the Glasgow pictures, but the whole canon, the landscape and the portraits. And you see, when you see the kind of range of things that he covered, the landscape, of course, as Paddy was saying, the Highlands and Islands were very much where he took his stills as well as his movies. And if you think about the portraiture, how important it is, the people he photographed, I've got a list which includes Alistair Gray, Compton Mackenzie, Hugh McDermott, Ian Hamilton Finlay, you know, and for all that work, for all his work, and yeah, of course, including the Glasgow pictures. And in there, he's in with so many other people, so many big names. And yet he still stands out. Joseph Mackenzie and Bill Brandt and Eric Watt, who we've just been talking about the other day, and Margaret Watkins, Humphrey Spender, and of course the aforementioned David Peat, who also turned out to be a guy who had a still round his neck all the time, even when he was making the movies. And so for that, what you end up feeling for Oscar, we talked about the affection, there's the admiration. I first met Oscar at Templar Films in Linder Street in Glasgow in 1962. Now, the previous year, Oscar had been on Seaman's Great Ships, which was, well, the joke was that Seaman's Great Ships for Films in Scotland had 2 Oscars. One was the wee Hollywood statuette that it got for being, and let me get this right, the best short film live action, in brackets, 1962. And of course, the other Oscar was the one called Marzoli. And if you actually get I think Paddy was talking about going to the Moving Image Archive of the National Library of Scotland. You can see Seaman's Great Ships there. And there's a scene in which the great crane is swinging around, and high up on the crane, there's a man walking. And that man is Oscar. And so you can actually see him in the movie. But what was particularly remarkable about that was that Oscar did not like heights. And he said that he only did this because it was for the one person he would have done it for, which was the director, the New York director, Hilary Harris, who made Sea with the Great Ships. And you wonder what a New York director is doing in Scotland. Well, of course, he was brought there by the great John Grierson. And I once spent a couple of hours with Oscar in another bleak and very exposed situation on, would you believe, the outside of the lighthouse at Kinnaird Head at Fraserburgh in the night. And the reason was that Eddie McCallum, we're looking at these cameramen, Eddie McCallum, another of Scotland's great camera persons, was trying to take a picture of the beam of light swaying around over the horizon, while Oscar and I clung to the outside. Oh, there's Oscar. Oh, crikey. Oh, gosh. Have I got to do all these names? Oh, welcome.
No, carry on with your story, David. I just brought this up because Eddie McConnell is in it. Do carry on.
Yeah, okay. Well, we can go back to I think I can do them all. Yep, I think okay, we'll come back to that. Right. Anyway, all I was going to say was that I was with Oscar on the outside of the lighthouse, freezing to death. And I was also with them on The Big Mill. The lighthouse was for Beyond the Grampians, Films of Scotland. Big Mill, which was another award-winning film, by the way, which was about Colville's and all that, and Gartcosh and Ravenscraig. And in that, it wasn't that you got hypothermia, it was that you were liable to get, I don't know what you call it, overheated, because it was exactly the contrast. A sort of heat stroke was the danger. Right, now we also know, of course, that when Oscar was working in all these films, he had the camera around his neck. But I think it's worth saying that there is another dimension to this. And I suspect Jennie may want to talk a bit about this, because in her interview with Oscar, which was remarkable itself that she did get an interview with Oscar, because she was hard to pin down at the best of times. But the thing which really interested me about that was that the amount of cultural references, visual cultural references that Oscar had, which I was never aware of, were quite astonishing. Of course, it may have started from the fact that he became a voracious reader when he was trapped by tuberculosis in his youth. But his references were, his reading references, his literary references were not in Burns and Shakespeare and Voltaire and Camus, but one specific one that really struck me. He said that he could see Gogol's dead souls in some pictures I've taken of alcoholics. And I think that takes us an awful lot more about Oscar than we think. In other words, you think of him with the snap around the streets of Glasgow. There's an infinite more to Oscar than that. But of course, the one last thing I really would want to say, Malcolm, which I think is important, is that, you know, the product of all these efforts, his legacy, the snaps, as he called them, are still ours, and thanks to GCU, you know, and they're there for posterity. I think it's hard to quantify, to exaggerate just how substantial is his gift to us. And for that, I think we have to thank Oscar and say mille grazie. Right, that's the end of my piece. What was the question, Malcolm?
There was not a question. We'll come back to the questions later. This is just done as a footnote because it does bring together a lot of guys. It's all guys here,
Yeah.
part of a certain kind of Scottish film scene. We don't need to dwell on this too much, but
No, they're all named, unfortunately, they're all named in the caption. But it's interesting, of course, it's Marty Singleton who has actually made the image.
Yeah.
And Forsyth Hardy, for those who are unaware, was the guy who ran Films of Scotland, produced 150 cinema documentaries at the time when there were cinema documentaries, including the aforementioned Oscar winning Series of Great Ships, and lots of the others like Big Mill won major awards. And he really did breed a whole generation of Scottish filmmakers, gave them experience, and from that experience came the ambition to make fiction films. And there's Bill Forsyth at one end to prove the fact.
That's Bill there, Murray Grigger, and of course there is Oscar.
And
David,
yeah.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on now. So if you would like to stop your video. And Jennie, if you would like to join us. Now, this is Jennie in 2002, as the credit says. It's taken by Maud Salter. Maud Salter managed to get a hold of this huge Polaroid camera that had come across from Poland in the early 2000s. And Maud did this wonderful project of portraits of people, in poets, writers, people involved in literature. And Jennie was one of them. And this is her here. Are you with us, Jennie?
Yeah, I think so. Am I not?
Yeah, I see you now. I see you now. It's just the way that my screen presents itself. Any quick remarks on this photo in terms of the taking of it? Do you recall Maud taking your image back then?
For some reason, I think that we met in the gallery in York Place, but could that be true? I don't know. And then I remember spending a lot of time choosing the top I was wearing because it sort of matched my henna hair. Yeah, I don't remember very much more about it than that. We had a nice chat.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So your connection to literature here, Jennie, is that you edited and published a Scottish Book Collector, and whenever it was 87 to early early 90s. Maybe you can correct me on that in a bit.
Well, I'm really bad with dates. I did about 82 copies of it, so it was
Yeah.
a lot of issues actually.
Yeah, yeah. I want to acquire all of those copies because I'm kind of obsessed with magazines and collecting them. But you're also proprietor of Main Point Books.
Yeah.
One of the.
Well, it's closed at the moment actually with the lockdown. Well, with the situation really.
Yeah.
And I hope to open it up again.
Yeah. But when you were doing interviews and stuff for the magazine in the 80s, you did interview Oscar, and that was published in Scottish Book Collector, and we republished that in the book of the exhibition that we did, because although Oscar's known about, in actual fact, you very rarely get to hear him or the writing of him or his voice. But we can come back to that in terms of what you've been searching for recently. But you've been very helpful. You got in touch with the son of Alan Campbell McLean, who was a writer who worked with Oscar. And they travelled together often in the Highlands. And this is an image that Oscar took of him and James Grassie, who I think worked with the Highland Development Board at the time, but also a writer. But you have a letter that you were sent back whenever it was. Could you share that letter with us and tell us about it?
Well, I should probably, as a preamble, it was at Alan's house that I first met Oscar. And they had a fantastic rule. Whenever they met, they were hatching a project. And so there was always this, they really had a lot of glee and so on in each other's company. And there was a real crackle of, right, what are we going to do? So it was actually wonderful when I look back on it to actually been just sat there taking it in. And this particular letter from Gus is about one of the occasions. It was they were going to make try and get photograph. It was well, they got the photographs. It became the cover of the second edition of Explore the Highlands and Islands. And Alan says it's dated 28th of May 1976. So he says, and this was a trip with Oscar and Jim. On Tuesday afternoon, I led Jim and Oscar down the huge precipice by the 338 steps in the rock, descending the declivity to the bottom, but no big Caithness sky with great white galleons of clouds charging around, a bloody murk of Har, slate grey sea, all colour drained out of the landscape. So we went on to Wick, booked in at Mackay's, a grotty hotel, and decided to plod on to John O'Groats in the hope of finding a break in the murk. Right at John O'Groats it came, so we hot-footed it back to Whillago, and miraculously the sun made a brief appearance. So it was a case of charging down the 338 steps again, Oscar leaping around like a mountain goat, camera clicking furiously. A frantic 10-minute session, then the sun faded into a quite sinister chalk-white orb and vanished in the shit, as Oscar calls it. Be interesting to see what he managed to grab when it's developed. P.S. Made a gallant attempt on Wednesday afternoon to reach the summit of Benbraggie so that we could piss on the stone of the Duke of Sutherland, the monument to the Duke of Sutherland. Failed, alas, some 3 miles from his grace. More of this when I see you. So I think that captures a wee bit of their feeling of going on a kind of boys' jaunt and actually coming back with, you know, great stuff like this view from Oscar. Do you know, I've been thinking though about Oscar's photographs and how they have touched me. And you know, I had a child. I think people forget how much children, particularly children, were on the streets in those days, and not just children, but you know, as a child, when I was a wee girl in Newcraig Hall with my auntie there, you know, you'd be put out first thing in the morning, you'd be wrapped in clothes for all weathers, and you'd be out all day long. And this is like from the age of maybe 2, you know, there were just tribes of children out there. And at dinner time, which was in the middle of the day, you'd get a jam piece put out the window, and you just keep on playing outside whatever you were doing. And that might well be like in some of Oscar's pictures, you see the kids, they're on the pavements and they're a wee bit manky. And it really is like I was, you know, I feel that so strongly. I love the way that he's got that piece of street life as it was. The houses were often very tiny. And, you know, I shared a bed with my two cousins, Billy and Julia. Billy was at the other end of the bed. And in those houses, behind those walls of those tenements that you see in Oscar's pictures were people in very crowded conditions and without any of the sort of, you know, mod cons or anything like that. And so it was quite, and Joan Erdley commented how easy it was to get the slum kids to come up and just sit in her studio, you know, for her. And that's right, you were out and about, and, you know, these wee Gallus boys from Castle Milk, you know, you were sort of chasing after the rag and bone man, you were doing all sorts of things, but it really was that you had a child's world that adults barely seemed to intervene into. So I think he captures that feeling a lot, and it has an emotional content for me, which is really strong. And approaching Oscar, I found a wee notebook that once I started doing Scottish Book Collection, one of the tapes I haven't found my tape of Oscar, but I did find one of Norman McCaig, which was the first tape I did. But I found a wee notebook, and it's got names of people who I might interview. And if there's Oscar Marzaroli ? And Oscar was just a beautiful guy. I think it was very generous of him. I have this really odd feeling that I met him in a room in Jordan Hill College, but surely that can't be right. But whatever. And he certainly did talk about his archive. He talked about all of his negatives and everything, and what was going to happen. He actually talked about what would happen to it, speculatively. So I think it was I didn't realize at the time that has anyone else actually interviewed Oscar, do you think?
I've never seen any interviews with Oscar anywhere else. I mean, you mentioned in that interview in the original magazine of Scottish Book Collector that you met him at the college. So it must have been the case.
Yeah, it must. Oh, was it in that? I didn't realise it was in it. I was just picturing it actually. And I think they'd given him this big room. And the thing about Alan's house at the time, it was also a sort of very interesting hub, because West Highland Free Press had started in 1972. So Brian Wilson would always come through. He was the founding editor of the West Highland Free Press. He would come through and stay overnight. Because while the thing was just to collect the thing at the printer, which was printed in Inverness. You know, Alan was also involved in people at the the Barlinnie Special Unit and the development of people's sort of artistic lives in that sort of experimentally happened. But perhaps one of the oddest things that happened when I was visiting Oscar with Alan, and was it Crown Circus in Glasgow? I can't remember, his studio in the centre.
Yes.
Crown Circus.
Park Circus.
Park Circus, that's it. Well, we were there, and I think Alan had been chairman of the Labour Party for a while, but he got really pissed off. I'm not sure if I'm remembering it rightly. I think it was something to do with their nuclear policy. Anyway, along came the very young George Robertson, and he'd been sent along to drag Alan to some sort of Labour Party important meeting. But Alan refused, and we just had such a laugh about this afterwards. It was really funny. So.
Okay. Well, that's great. Now, I should say that your search for the tape that may have Oscar's voice in it continues. You've found. We'll kind of look forward to that if you do find it. But the journey of the search is all part of the process, Jennie, and I can't quite recall where
it really is. I've actually found out. Basically, I had no idea I had so many things. So I've got probably about 60 or 70 things gathered together now of different interviews that I did, And I've also got a cable that allows you to digitize all of this stuff. So that's the plan. But I mean, on my last expedition into the basement of the shop, which is such a shambles, I found a mini disc of John Byrne and a mini disc of Des Dillon. So it's still stuff to find, I think.
Yeah, and you've still not found the tape of...
No,
of
it's heartbreaking.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
mod
Well,
either.
It's just, it's the way it is. But the good thing about you interviewing Oscar is that you published it, and it did exist in a magazine that very few people in this day and age knew about, which was why it was great to republish it. So, you know, the past connects with the present in a good way. So unless there's something else you would like to mention, Jenny?
No, that's it. I want to say it's very honoured to have the interview. That was lovely.
Thank you, Jenny.
You put it into your book, thanks.
Okay, so you switch your video off and hopefully Alistair will be able to join us now.
Done, yeah, hello.
You there? Yeah. So
Yeah.
last week, I think it was last week, Alistair, time is rushing by, I can't quite remember, but you were involved in a live stream with us talking about, well, we screened the Clyde film and then you were in discussion about that, telling us a lot of stories about Cranhill, Cranhill Arts Project, who made the film, or Cranhill Films, as it was known at the time. The Clyde film is available from the Moving Image Archive for people who want to watch that. But it was a fascinating illumination of our fairly recent past, Alistair, that you gave on that event, and we'll be sharing that on YouTube very soon. But you're a digital designer, but in your earlier days, apart from Glasgow School of Art, you were involved in the establishment of Cranhill Arts and in the making of the Clyde film. And you can see 4 of the crew here, you in the middle back, and Ken Curry to your left on our right. What is the connection to Oscar Marzaroli, Alistair?
David Bruce. We made a film called Glasgow 1984 on Super 8. We were into Super 8 and guerrilla filmmaking and telling it like it was. And we, on the strength of that Super 8 masterpiece, we went to the Scottish Film Council. And we also went to the Scottish Film Archive and spoke to them about films about Glasgow, because we wanted to make a kind of poetic film about Glasgow using the narrative driven by Glasgow songs sung by people that we knew and were friendly with. And I think it was David that put us in touch, in his job at the time, put us in touch with Oscar, and we hired Oscar's Ogham office edit suite, the Steenbeck there, for longer than it should have taken us to edit, but we had to learn on the job. And so we were in contact with Oscar 1984 and 1985, editing, at the beginning of 85, editing the film up there. We obviously knew who Oscar was in the context, and we knew about his photographs, but we didn't really know much. We had, of course, seen Glasgow 1980, which was a film that Ogham made, shot in 35mm. You mentioned it before, and it was edited by Bill Forsyth. And that was Films of Scotland and Glasgow Corporation. And so we that was a kind of the enemy film. But that's not how we saw it at all at that, talking to Oscar about how it was made. I mean, obviously he made the film and it was paid for, and it was all part of a completely different era. It's 13 years before we made our film, and Glasgow had changed just quite a bit in that time, certainly for everybody. So it was, but Oscar gave us a lot of support at the time of editing the film, and we were able to to hire. A lot of people were getting out of filmmaking. I don't know if Oscar was, but his facilities were there and available. And David also helped us contact BBC and STV. Their news departments were getting out of it, so there was lots of 16mm ends that we could. So kind of, they also gave us money to you know, it's an expensive business making 16mm. So Janet McBain also encouraged us to discuss with Oscar stuff that he'd made. I've never seen Dear Green Place, which I would like to, because it kind of sounds a bit like the film that we made, in that you've got Ewan McCall and Peggy Seeger doing the singing, and there's stills, and it sounds much more personal from Oscar. So some of the people that are on here tonight will have seen it and know, so I would like to ask them about that. We were interested in Glasgow from our perspective, and Oscar's photographs had been a big influence to us. After the film, I worked for Cranial Arts Project, and we were pretty keen to involve people in kind of dealing with the Glasgow that was round about them. And we'd started by doing photography classes and gone into filmmaking on that. And we carried on after it. We never made another film after Clyde film. More people could get involved in the photography projects that we did. And we talked a lot to people at the time. I mean, Oscar's photographs were, and his vision of Glasgow was something that we were aware of, and it really spoke to us. I mean, at the time, there was a huge kind of move. We all knew Glasgow was better. Before Glasgow Culture City, there was a Glasgow's Miles Better campaign, but photographic books, apart from Oscar's, there wasn't really published books of other people that you've mentioned tonight, but you got a lot of Victorian lampposts and Edwardian pub signs and photographs from photographers that will make a lot of money out of selling the kind of Edwardian and Victorian architectural legacy as the city. So we, spurred on by Oscar and his vision of the city, we went on to do a big photographic survey of Glaswegians. Every picture has a person in it. Yeah, so but one of the things that Oscar was talking about was when, you know, working on films from this in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the photographs that we knew, that we asked him about, were taken when he was out filming for the day. I mean, that one, Bridges on the River Clyde, or in 1963, there's a shot in a film I saw much later from that viewpoint. It's about the Clean Air Act and smokeless zones. So there's, you know, there's a pan round, and you can see all the smoke in the Gorbals, and the city centre is smoke-free as it is in that photograph. And the Castlemilk boys, there's, you know, he's in Castlemilk filming, but he's in Castlemilk with his brain and his camera, and his vision that we know isn't in the films, although it's a different vision, because they weren't films that he authored in that way. They were for films for Scotland, of Scotland, and the boosterism of Glasgow Corporation. Glasgow Corporation made a lot of films, and it's really interesting that what lives on as Oscar's vision of Glasgow and his record of Glasgow are the still photos, to me, the still photographs. But I think everyone should watch Glasgow 1980. It's really interesting. There's they've got I worked afterwards up until not long before his death. Worked with Matty Singleton, and we used him as a cameraman. I talked to him a lot about it. They shot a film in the late 70s called Glasgow's Progress. It's 35mm. There's about 96 minutes rushes of that in the fridge up in Kirkintilloch. Only one of them's ever been digitised. And I mean, again, that would be a brilliant record of the city at the end of the 70s. Kind of the whole boosterism of the corporation didn't exist because it was Glasgow District Council by that point, and they didn't really make films, and I think they'd started shooting it on spec. I don't know, I'm just going by what Marty told us later, because I was really quite interested in what was in that and in that archive.
Okay, that's fascinating. Now, there is on Chris Leslie's website a short segment of the film Reimagining Glasgow, and Chris uses quite a bit of Glasgow 1980 footage, but also the follow-up film, so it must be that one reel that has been digitised, so it kind of connects back then to actually Glasgow as it is more or less now, to illustrate the fact that, yeah, it's a city in constant process of renewal. But I mean, absolutely fascinating, Alistair. We will be sharing the YouTube of the event that we did with you, because the story of Cranhill Arts is something that has to be shared, and the project Glaswegians is something that definitely needs to be revisited.
I mean, Oscar was a big influence on us, and we went on, we did a big exhibition of our photographs and photographs of Glasgow in 1991 in the tramway, and we went over and Anne helped us pick Oscar's prints for it. We had Bert Hardy's photos because they were very different from Oscar's. Oscar's photographs were his photographs as a Glaswegian of Glasgow, and they were not press. Great photographs, Bert Hardy's picture post photographs of Glasgow, but we wanted people to see Oscar's photos in that context, and helped us pick the photographs that were shown in that exhibition. That was really interesting to see them side by side with a press photographer and how different they were. I mean, when we were exhibiting, we exhibited photos of Glaswegians all over the place, and I remember, just in terms of what the photographs mean to me, I'm the same age as the golden-haired lass in that famous photograph that was kind of catapulted Oscar into people of my generation and younger's consciousness, I would say, in Glasgow. And we were putting an exhibition up in what's demolished now, with the Strathclyde Regional Headquarters. It was photographs that we'd taken. It's all part of Culture City. It was pictures of people. We only ever took pictures of people. That was us. And we were putting the photographs up after the place had closed, and the cleaners were all in, and they were kind of just finishing their shift. And they came out, and a big discussion started about Oscar and Oscar's photographs and what they meant. And it was a kind of almost an asparagus. One of the cleaners says to us, "I'm that girl with the golden hair." And another one said, "No, I'm the girl with the golden hair." No, she didn't say no, she said, "I am the girl with the golden hair." And another one said, "I'm the girl with the golden hair." And we started talking about photographs and what they meant and how and should they say, they weren't claiming to be that girl, they were that girl. Like, a generation of us were there at the time as children in these photographs. And that Glasgow that Oscar, that particular Glasgow that Oscar recorded there, doesn't exist. It exists in the memories of those women that I was talking to and in Oscar's photographs. And there was a lot of clearing away and a lot of everything necessary in a lot of cases, but the importance of Oscar's images to Glaswegians is pretty amazing. It shows his vision. You know, it's not a nostalgia trip. It's something else, something beyond that. It doesn't exist, but he was there with that brain and that eye, and always had his camera with him. You know, and he recorded something that you can't get elsewhere apart from in your own head. You know.
That's brilliant, Alistair. Thanks for sharing that story again about Strathclyde Regional Council building, because that is fascinating and says something about the ubiquitousness of Oscar's photographs, but photography in general. So we'll come back to some of that briefly, I hope. So if it's all right with you, we'll move on to the next person. So thanks, Alistair. If you want to switch your video off, and if we can ask Norrie to join us now. Norrie is was a journalist and runs the Lost Glasgow website and platform, which is very much a part of, oh gosh, I mean, I was in a messenger exchange with Norrie last night, and he described himself as merely a thread in the warp and weft of Glasgow's human tartan, which I thought was just a wonderful poetic way of putting it. But I also learned a new term from you, Norrie, and you know, I thought I kind of knew all the Glasgow terms, which was that you were in with the bricks, and that means you're a part of the fabric of the city. And I think Lost Glasgow is very much that, and it's very relevant in relation to Oscar in terms of part of the fabric of the city, a sense of who we are and how that is portrayed. So are you with us, Norrie? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Right. I see you now. So tell us something. So fabric of the city, Oscar Marzaroli. What's his legacy mean to you?
It's one of these strange things. I grew up with a Glasgow art teacher mum and a Glasgow architect dad. So I was brought up with a visual awareness. My mum had that magic trick of, I was always getting dragged around exhibitions. And she'd stand me in front of whether it was a painting or a photograph, and she would never tell me what I was looking at. She would ask me, what do you see? And you develop this visual lexicon, for want of a better word, of how you see the world. And I've always sort of seen the world, whether it's Glasgow, Gdansk, whatever, I sort of see the world through as if it's got a frame around it. And I was aware of Oscar's work growing up, I think as so many folk were, his classic Glasgow images. But it was only, and the same with Ricky Ross of Deacon Blue, the 1984 exhibition at the Third Eye Centre. And I don't think I'd ever seen, I'm pretty sure I'd never actually been to a photographic exhibition, and certainly not a photographic exhibition that showed my city. And I was just absolutely blown away, not just by the imagery, but it was also that fascinating thing of you're in the Third Eye Centre was usually, let's say, those and such as those. It was the arty set in Glasgow, for want of a better word. And all of a sudden, here was the Third Eye Centre, full of wee Glaswegians, wee grannies and wee guys in bunnets, because they weren't, for them, looking at art. They were looking at themselves. They were seeing themselves reflected in Oscar's photographs. These weren't strangers they were looking at. It was them, it was their aunties and uncles, it was their mums and dads, it was their cousins and their brothers and their neighbours. And that's something about the democratic nature of Oscar's work. We see ourselves reflected in it. And speaking of recognising folk in pictures, this wonderful picture, and I think it's the Celtic end at Hampden during the cup final, keeking out, bottom right, you can just see him, but I would recognise his stony brow anywhere. Is no, just to the right. That's the man, James Maylie, a Glasgow International Brigadier who caught the bus from George Square and went all the way to Spain in 1938 to fight for the Republicans, captured at the Battle of Jarama. and then exchanged in a prisoner swap and came back to Glasgow and lived to a ripe old age. And I had the pleasure of knowing James in his later life. I met him a couple of times. As one of his sons, Willie Maylie, Professor Willie Maylie. Here we are together at the opening of the exhibition. Willie Maylie and his brother wrote a wonderful play called From the Carlton to Catalonia about his father's experiences of the Spanish Civil War. And myself and Willie go way back to our college years, and only sort of recently, in the last few years, reconnected via Facebook. And when we met at the opening of the Marzoli exhibition, it was just absolutely brilliant. But as I say, I mean, that first Third Eye Centre exhibition, I was, as I say, with an art teacher mum who would barge in any conversation. I saw Oscar standing, speaking to a crowd of folk, and I thought, I've got to go over and say something. And I went over and just said, yeah, thank you very much, sort of thing. And Oscar turned his gaze on me, and he had a real twinkle about him. And he gave me, I was a spotty 18-year-old student, and he gave me his full attention for about 5 minutes and spoke to me. And I walked away feeling about 6 foot tall. And I was going to say I never saw him again. I saw him once again when I was a student at Glasgow Tech, now the Cali, for the archive rests. I used to do 1 day a week out at the College of Building and Printing Annex out at Belgrove. And I came up out of Belgrove Station one morning about 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning and looked across the road, and there's Oscar with a camera up to his eye. And I thought, I'm going to go over and speak to him. And then I thought, the man's working, let him be. And I rue that day that I didn't cross the street and say, hello, Oscar. I'm sure you know, Malcolm, the response to this exhibition has just been remarkable. The response to the Oscar pictures that I've posted online during the course of the exhibition is always remarkable, because, as I say, folk recognise themselves. Folk see themselves in these pictures, and they see their city. Oscar is so much part of my mental and visual DNA of Glasgow. I talk about myself being in with the bricks. Oscar's in with the bricks. Oscar is inside me. And the fact that there are so few pictures of Oscar and so few interviews with Oscar. Next year I'll be the same age as Oscar was when he died, 55. Imagine what more Oscar could have done. Imagine all those pictures untaken. Imagine if we still had Oscar today, the grand old man, not just of Glasgow photography, not just of Scottish photography, because Oscar's work stands up there in the canon of world photography. It just so happened that he was in Glasgow. And that's the wonderful thing. He's our Oscar.
Yeah. That's wonderful, Norrie. And I forgot to mention, well, I didn't forget, but I'm mentioning it now, that you contributed a wonderful presentation earlier on in the year called Oscar Bravo. It was originally scheduled to happen at the Clydeside Distillery, in actual fact, to an audience of 50. But we did it online. Can't remember when it was, March, April, May.
Way back in March, I think, yeah.
Yeah, there was 450 odd people attended the live event that night online. And there's been many thousands watched that since then. So, you've still got pulling power, Norrie, in terms of your
only with the photographic community, not with the ladies, unfortunately.
So again, I mean, John, if you could share that link to Norrie's presentation, that would be great. Share the link to Lost Glasgow as well. So we'll move on. Norrie, okay.
If I can say one more thing,
yeah,
I found it wonderful. The first exhibition from Oscar's archive shared the building with the final exhibition of Alistair Gray's work, because there's that wonderful line in Lanark where they say, Glasgow is a magnificent city. Why does nobody realise that? And they go into that big riff about how if an artist hasn't lived in a city and spoken about a city and painted a city and pictured a city, then even its own residents don't live there in their imaginations. And that's what Oscar did. Oscar gave me a Glasgow of the imagination that I still live in every day. And that is, I just thought, a wonderful synchronicity.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for mentioning that, Norrie. So we'll hear from you very shortly, I imagine. So thanks, Norrie. Chris, are you with us?
Hello.
Hi. So anybody who tuned in on Thursday will have seen Chris's film Reimagining Glasgow, which combines his own footage along with that of Marzaroli's Glasgow 1980, as well as some of the unseen footage of its follow-up, which is it was great to see that, Chris, and that was shown alongside Dear Green Place, which has been very rarely seen. So thanks for your cooperation in that. But Chris is a filmmaker and photographer. Hopefully there's a kind of connection there in terms of reimagining Glasgow with Chris's long-term project, Disappearing Glasgow, which I hope some or most people are familiar with. There was a book published a few years ago. It's not available anymore, folks. So if you see it in Oxfam Bookshop, snap it up, because it's a great book, something Chris has been working on for many years. But Chris has just published another book, which is called Balkan Journey, A Balkan Journey, and that takes Chris back to some of his earlier days of photography and almost right up to the present. There was a great feature in one of the newspapers fairly recently, Chris, about that, but you can mention that in due course. Look out for an exhibition happening next year of A Balkan Journey, and we'll do a book launch of that. What's the connection? What's the Balkan connection here to you, photography, and Oscar Marzaroli?
Well, I was just going to answer that just with a quick slideshow which covers the Balkans and my connection. So I'm hoping if I do share screen and if I do Keynote on Me and do share, and then if I hit play, can you see?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're good to go. So I know time's short and I know people have been hanging on. There's been a lot been said, so I'm just going to read through a couple of slides. So basically, my first connection with Oscar was back in 1997 when I met Anne, Oscar's wife, who donated some of Oscar's darkroom equipment to a photography project that was setting up in Bosnia. Back then, I wasn't a working photographer. I wouldn't even call myself a photographer. And back then, I had no idea who Oscar Marzaroli was. A Scottish charity who were running convoys to Bosnia were taking equipment for this project to the Balkans, and they'd put me in touch with her, told her about my project idea about running this project in Bosnia, and Anne wanted to donate some of Oscar's darkroom equipment towards that. So that was my first kind of introduction. And this project, which ran, was called the Sarajevo Camera Kids, and it ran in the summer of 1997. Using Oscar's equipment and other darkroom equipment and cameras that were donated from across Scotland, I set up a makeshift darkroom
and organised photo classes in the basement of an orphanage in Sarajevo in Bosnia. The pupils I worked with were aged 6 to 16, and I taught them basic photography techniques, shooting with 35mm SLR film cameras, developing the films and printing as well. And we kind of ran around, and the children ran around the kind of playgrounds or streets, photographed anything and everything that interested them. It's very much a street photography kind of project, if you like. Their playgrounds, their friends, their favourite hangouts. And this was all against the backdrop of a kind of heavily destroyed city that was just re-emerging after this kind of long siege and war. And kind of like 20 years later now, when I'm you know, now knowing about Oscar's work and about his influence and his importance, it then just kind of hit me about this amazing to think that there's a wee tiny seed of his legacy that exists in this project, and exists within Sarajevo in Bosnia. So I finally get round to acknowledging and thinking about this donation and meeting Anne all those years ago, and I've finally got around to acknowledging in this book, Balkan Journey, which is a limited edition photo book. Sorry, it's a shameless plug here for the self-publishing world. And this book documents that project, the Sarajevo Camera Kids, and other journeys over a 25-year period in the region. But anyway, back to Oscar and me. Sales pitch over. So by 2009, I'm a photographer, I feel like, and I know and obviously love Oscar's work. I'm studying a master's in documentary photography, and I really want to make Glasgow the kind of focus in my final project. And I'm looking at Oscar's work for inspiration, but Glasgow no longer seems to exist. There's no ends in the streets. The streets are almost empty nowadays. And I think, you know, in Glasgow in the kind of 21st century, a kind of, you know, men with beards and SLR cameras around their shoulders aren't really looked upon as favourably as they might have been in his days. So everything seems quite different. But the kind of focus, I mean, obviously lots of Oscar's photographs of the late 1960s documents this kind of construction of the high-rise flats going up all over the city. And, you know, in 2008, when I'm doing this, starting my master's project, Glasgow announces its latest round of regeneration, I feel like, and they talk about Glasgow's skyline being transformed in terms of housing. And this kind of difference now, 50 years later, what we're seeing is the buildings that Oscar originally documented up are now being demolished. And this kind of 8-year project I done, this being in Glasgow, documented 6 areas of the city that were either radically transformed or disappeared altogether. And I kind of now, and when I was putting all this work together for the book, I kind of see it almost like as a follow-up of Oscar's work, a kind of continuation of the documentaries of the city's seemingly endless cycle of regeneration. This goes on, it happens all the time in Glasgow. And it's almost like the passing down of a baton in terms of kind of Oscar's work, in terms of the work I've kind of continued with. And, you know, these buildings are no longer fit, they're labelled no longer fit for habitation, they're out of fashion. They're riddled with socio-economic problems, and these were the kind of utopian landscapes that Oscar photographed that were once seen as a solution are now seen as a problem. And from the kind of time I documented, ran this project, from 2008 to 2016, Glasgow lost 40% of its high-rise social housing. And today the kind of city ponders what comes next, how long it will last. And also kind of, you know, what photographers are kind of next to be handed this baton to document the next kind of round of regeneration for years to come. Because this seems to continually repeat itself. And I just, you know, Oscar's documentation of the flats going up, my photographs of the flats coming down, and then, you know, what comes next is really interesting. And just very finally, Oscar's wonderful photographs of the Glasgow landscape were also, of course, matched with his portraits of people and communities in Glasgow and beyond. And the closest kind of connection in terms of photography I ever got to this was when I documented Paddy's Market about a year and a half before it closed in 2009. And that kind of, you know, looking through my own archive, I was trying to make this connection between the Paddy's market that Oscar knew and photographed, and the Paddy's market that I kind of knew and photographed in its last days. But in many ways, nothing had changed. Paddy's market was timeless. It was black and white, and it was full of Glasgow characters, weather beaten but with occasional cheery faces. And I chose to shoot Paddy's market, much of it in black and white film, just as Oscar did. And in its final days, before its closure, it had more of an archival feel than it did have before, despite it existing in a world with all this glorious digital, Technicolor photography. It was still that black and white landscape and characters that Oscar had shot. And when doing the talk for this presentation, I looked through some of the kind of rushes of unreleased film called Glasgow's Progress that Oscar filmed in 1977 that Malcolm was talking about earlier, that followed Glasgow's 1980. It was never released. And a lot of this kind of featured Paddy's market, this footage. And as I was going through the digitised footage, this market trader caught my attention. And I was sure I knew her. I was sure I'd photographed her, but obviously that was impossible. But this kind of connection came across. And when I looked through my archive and started matching things up, and after a wee bit of digging and phone calls, I found out that this portrait that I took in 2009 of market trader Bessie was in fact the daughter of the woman from Oscar Marzaroli's film footage from 1977. And it's a fitting connection highlighting the generations who worked in the market, and a kind of testament to the endurance of how long Paddy's market existed. An old Glasgow and Glaswegians that no longer exist in real life, but as an archive collection, it will survive intact for many future generations to treasure. And that, to me, just again going back to the importance of this archive and people getting to see Oscar's work, is really important. And that was the connections I kind of made in this time. So thanks for listening.
That's great, Chris.
Sharing my screen.
Yeah. So, I mean, what that does illustrate is that it wasn't just back then. There's this continuum going on of development all of the time. And that's quite fascinating. So could I ask everyone to put their video back on now? And we've quite rightly run over time, but I think that's justifiable. And the audience has stayed with us.
Nothing else to do, Malcolm. The world's in
well, it's a Saturday night, lockdown. It's better than the TV, isn't it?
Yes.
Connected.
Fortunately, we're not having to watch Strictly.
This is what this is all about, connectedness. So what a fantastic range of contributions there. So thank you all very much. Is there anything you want to ask of one another quickly, and before we mention a couple of comments from people?
Well, if Paddy's still about, I've got to pull her up, because she had me beaten up down the hidden lane years back when I was an extra in Brond.
I remember that night very well.
It was bloody freezing, and
of course it was.
You had fires burning and all sorts, and I hung about for hours and hours and hours. I think we did about 3 takes. I get chased down the lane by 2 big guys, and in the final take, just as sort of came to the end, I tripped over one of the loose cobbles and did one of those spectacular arse over tit falls into the cardboard boxes that you'd hidden in the corner, and took a proper kicking. So, and then of course I watched Bronze from start to finish, and I'm on screen for all of about 2 seconds. Thank you for that.
That was a night when we actually almost had the electricians pulling the plugs out, because we were getting into what was then called golden time, which meant you were paying them all around the clock.
Yeah.
Can I put a question to you, Jenny, that's come in from Alan Kelly? did Oscar express any thoughts on what he would like to happen with his archive? Because you referenced that.
Yeah, he did. He didn't say what he wanted. He wanted it to be somewhere. He was just. I think at that time. I think that he was wondering how it could be preserved, and I wonder what the background is within the family. I mean, his daughters have been sort of magnificent in actually guarding and promoting that archive, haven't they? And I wonder what the conversations were between his wife and him about that subject.
Yeah, I mean, he's a relatively young man at that time when you interviewed him, so your
yeah, he was sort of looking at all the stuff and he was saying, look at it all, all these drawers. He was opening drawers and saying, look at this. So yeah, it takes space. It's obviously not digital, just space.
Yeah. So Ian Bain says, thanks, Jenny. Lovely listening to you. Ian Bain again says, thanks, Alistair. Great anecdotes. And Michael Prince says, really enjoyed Alistair's contribution. Someone else says, in relation to Alan again says, great story and link, Chris, in terms of connecting the past with the present. All great comments. I think people are completely blown away that there's no actually any direct questions that I can see. Morag Ramsey does say, love this idea of the Glasgow of the imagination. So important to have Glasgow portrayed artistically for it to really exist. I think that's a really good comment.
It's one of these things that is so important, and we, in focusing particularly on Oscar, we forget the artistic milieu that Oscar operated in. It's artists, it's filmmakers, it's photographers, it's painters, it's poets, it's writers. And that still exists today. A new generation, guys like Chris, who I only got to know through my Lost Glasgow stuff. What Chris is doing today, and what a whole new generation of young Glasgow artists, photographers, painters, graffiti artists. That is as vibrant today as it ever was. And that shared vibrancy is what will, 30 years from now, is what a new generation of young Glaswegians will look back on and say, that was our Glasgow. Just as our older generation look back at Oscar's work and say that was our Glasgow. What's been created today, particularly under lockdown, which is fascinating, a future generation of Glaswegians are going to look back on and say, that was our Glasgow. And that vibrancy, we talk about the constant reinvention of Glasgow. Glasgow's like a shark. It's got to keep moving, to keep breathing. And yeah, as an old mate used to say, Glasgow, it'll be nice when it's finished. Glasgow will never be finished, because we're in a constant state of reinvention. And that's how it must be. That's how it must be.
Okay, thank you, Norrie. Any other comments from the panel folk here at all?
I was just going to add to what Norrie was saying. I think what's important as well, thank you, Malcolm, fiver in the post, is when you're documenting Glasgow as well, that it's accessible, and I think it's accessible to the city and people can get it. And that was my whole, Oscar's remit in terms of, and everybody talked about his earlier shows and people coming up and, talking about the reflection back. Because I think if you miss Glasgow out of the picture in terms of, if it's something you don't get, if it's a kind of fine art photography, or if it's something different, a bit more abstract. And that was why, with disappearing Glasgow, it had to be accessible for me as well. And I wanted to use real Glasgow voices. Because the story, as much as Glasgow is this city that constantly changes and whatever, it's a riot in many ways, and it's fine if you're an artist or an architect and a creative mind. You can imagine what you can do with all these empty places and all these schemes that disappear. But it's a really shit place to live if you actually live in these schemes, and that's always been really important to me, and obviously it's important to Oscar as well. It's to make it accessible and to make it social history and not just art, you know. And that's really important for me and Oscar, I think.
Point, Chris. Alan?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's been a couple of things that were said. Chris has talked quite a lot about the legacy of passing down the baton, and I think that is desperately important. I mean, I felt a certain responsibility. Oscar photographed things like the Red Road flats going up, Queen Elizabeth Square going up. I made the effort, as largely because of that, to go and photograph them coming down. You know, that is part of a continuum. That's important. Paddy also talked about the importance of, you know, Chris was talking about catalyst. Ogham Films, the Arlington Bar, the Halt, you can't emphasize enough how much they were a catalyst. On a Friday afternoon, a Friday evening, I, with my brother Brian, who's the editor, go out the back door, the smoke-filled editing suite with that Steenbeck that he worked at. You never knew who you'd met. One day, as a young, impressionable person, I met Lindsay Kemp in there doing a film of the Magic Circus. We all trailed out the back door of Subterranean Ogham, down past Tree Film, picked up Charlie Gormley, the Coulters, Steve Clark Hall, you know, you name it, Doug Eady, and then whiled away the hours in the Arlington Bar. And Oscar was like the consolidating factor. He was the catalyst for that. In the context of his Italian background, it's maybe unfortunate to say, but he was the godfather in that situation. And he had such a huge personality, but quiet and assuming, that allowed him to indulge his photography in Glasgow. And the one thing I want to say, as somebody who has traveled a lot to Cambodia and different things and photographed aspects of life around the world, not just in Glasgow. I mean, I spent a time after Oscar died, a whole summer, traveling 1,500 miles around Glasgow, photographing things that looked as though they hadn't changed. What Oscar managed to retain was that freshness. He was looking at the same place all the time. It's easy to go somewhere else and find freshness. He just kept finding it in his own city. Fabulous.
Yeah, okay, that's very good. And people have been asking, of course, and one can only speculate, what would he be photographing now? Well, hopefully he'd still be doing the same, more or less, but perhaps not as light on his feet as he was then. He would be doing the work that Chris is doing and other photographers as well. Now, I'm conscious of the time now, you know, and I think we're going to pull this to an end, but very, very shortly. Alan, though, I'd like to ask you, could you just very briefly tell us about the story of the priest?
Ha!
Would you mind?
Yeah, no, I don't mind. I wondered if it was appropriate, but in a way I just think it's the best legacy and tribute, sorry, the phone's going off, to Oscar that you could get. My brother and I went to visit him shortly before he died, and he was in his bed in Baillieston, and I remember the image of boxes of neg files under the bed, you know, the legacy sitting there, and he was very philosophical and bright despite the circumstances. But at the time of the funeral, we went from the house from Baillieston to the cemetery just outside, and it was a very Glasgow Italian affair. It was the grave was surrounded by men in black, and at the head of the grave was Oscar's great friend, Father Hennessy, his confidant and also a mutual Celtic supporter, so they had a lot in common. And he was conducting the ceremony. The rain was coming down like stair rods. Stair rods is the only way, you know, it's hard to describe it. Really, it was piercing through you. And all the people around the grave had their heads bowed, not in reverence, but to stop this rain pelting them to death. And the altar boy that was attending to the priest vanished. He ran away. And he came back to the back to put over Father Hennessy. And he put it up, and fittingly, it was black and white. And then you looked closer, and on the panels were the Bunny Club logo. And I nudged Tom Busby, another name from the past, beside me. I said, "You've got to look at this." And Tom went, and just put his head down. He didn't want to get up because of the rain. And he looked up, and then he had to choke a guffaw, you know, and his distinctive Canadian drawl, he turned to me, he said, "That's Oscar's way of just telling you, never go anywhere without a camera." And that was, you know, it doesn't get better than that. On the way back, the rain stopped, the sun came out, and there was this wonderful vision of Glasgow with the most amazing dark, black, grey photographer sky. And I just thought, there you go, Oscar, that's for you. Just couldn't have been better.
Yeah. Absolutely, I remember that so well, Alan, too. Charlie and I standing there and saying,
"Thank you."
Oscar did it
wonderful, wonderful. The priest actually in the funeral who said the good Lord knew what he was doing because he took Oscar away on the Friday, because on the Saturday Celtic had got beat by Rangers.
Yeah.
And also I do remember, sorry, you want to stop walking, but also I do remember that funeral and the fact that the number of people who got lost on the way. And
that's right, yeah, it was quite a drive out of town, you know, quite a cavalcade. And again, probably most of the Scottish film industry at the time. You know,
they were there.
Which was compact, you know, you forget how compact it was, you know, it was quite a, you know, I'm sorry, I can't remember, was it, someone was talking about working at the Steenbeck down in, you know, Ogham was like an Aladdin's cave. You went down this basement and there were these huge pictures to me, 5 foot, 6 foot square pictures. And one that struck you with the Castlemilk latch right at the end. Oscar's private domain was behind that. He had his office, the dark room where Ken Murray, his printer, would work at the time. You go into the basement, you'd never know who you'd find. I knew my brother would be there because he was the editor at the time. And as Paddy said, on a Friday afternoon, that was it. You know, the whole Scottish industry retired to the Arlington or the Holt Bar, you know.
When we can retire to bars again, I'm looking forward to that.
And it's, you know, Norrie also said, you know, it's hard to realize now. I was a young man at the time, and Oscar seemed a much older and secure father figure who gave me a lot of advice and a lot of help with my first exhibition. He was very generous. He came and talked me through that, encouraged me to be a photographer, well, and an architect. Great move. And it's hard to realize now, I mean, I'm 67 now, so, you know, that you're now, you know, I've been fortunate enough to have 8 years more than Oscar, you know. You do wonder if he had had that chance just to go into older life, what he would be coming up with. I'm sure it would be wonderful. And it would.
Well, his legacy remains, Alan, and there's lots going on now as well. So let's celebrate that and the connections and the connectedness that we do indeed have. I know that we could go on for much, much longer, and you've got more stories to tell. John, we will share links to Chris's websites and such like, along Alistair's talk that he did the other night there, which was great. But all your separate contributions are all linked in a completely fascinating way. We had posted, you know, we've done a regular thing, we always have, which is visitor of the day, which is like people who come to visit. It's like, oh, who are you, you know, and they're new to the city or they're new to a gallery or whatever. And it's been absolutely breathtaking, the number of people who've come along to see the Oscar show. But I just noticed a couple of comments in response to the one that was put up today. And a guy called Charlie Nairn says, I was dear Oscar's underling camera box carrier in his FIA days. My favourite and warmest man ever. You're a great lad. I highly recommend you, as I used to say when I finally got the camera box to the top of the hill. To the top of the hill. Someone called Mark Mackenzie says that the exhibition was the highlight of my year, as well as my partner, 3 daughters, and my elderly parents, including my 84-year-old father, who introduced me to Oscar's work when I was a teenager. Thank you for extending this and giving us the experience. A real ray of joy. So, I think that's a good place to leave this for the moment. But we're going to play Shades of Oscar, which is a 7-minute piece that we did with Marie Claire, one of Oscar's daughters, and we produced this when we went into lockdown. And it was designed originally to be toured on the Screen Machine, which is Scotland's mobile cinema, but obviously they were suffering from lockdown as well. But I think for those who haven't seen it, it's worth watching again, for those who can stay. But having said that, thank you all, and good riddance to 2020. And let's look forward to 2021.
Oscar Marzaroli was quite a unique person. He was born in Italy and he had quite a troubled background. He had 3 brothers who died in childhood, and he was back and forward between Italy and Glasgow. His parents set up here and they had a fish shop and a cafe in Byres Road, and their life was their work. So the children had quite a tough time growing up. It meant a lot of ill health through his childhood, resulting in him having TB when he was 18. And I think that was a turning point from Oscar, because he used to tell me that he was living on borrowed time. For him, the camera became his documentation of his life. Taking the photographs was about capturing that moment in time. He had quite a strong socialist view about the world, a very egalitarian man, somebody who thought we were all really equal and had that sense of reverence towards others. And he brought that warmth with him. And I think you can see that in the kind of photographs that he took. The first photograph I'm going to talk about is the nurse from the Crampian Sanatorium in Gcu. And that's a very poignant image. It was an image where he had suffered from TB and he was up there having respite. And at the time he was a very ill man and wasn't really expected to live. He started with his camera really probably at that point, and there's that warmth that comes across, because the one thing that Dad was able to do was to bring out warmth in people. He really felt he was saved when he went there. For years after that we went back. We stayed in the Cairngorms many times, we climbed mountains. For him, that was his place of suffering and renewal and growth and change. The next image evokes for me what Dad was really about, was the changing face of Glasgow. Buildings coming down, structures going back up, and that metamorphosis of the city that he loved. That sense of light and the change of light that he would have been waiting for, just to catch that moment where it becomes breathtaking rather than just a picture or a recording of a city. This photograph, he's perched high. I always think about how he managed to get as high as he was. Was he on the roof? He's looking down with all this community below, and the washing line and the sense of people around the windows, people hanging out windows, people looking out windows. There's a whole sense of community there that Dad felt he never had in his lifetime. That was hard for him, coming from Italy and going back and forward to Italy all his childhood, that he didn't really feel he belonged anywhere. And Glasgow was his chosen city, and when he did feel he belonged in this environment, all he wanted to do was capture communities at their very best. This is a marvellous little image of this wee girl. I've always felt that he didn't capture deprivation or social destitution. He wasn't interested in all of that. He was again about community and spirit and people having a place where they belonged and could grow up together. Quite a sad image in many ways. Dad felt that society had been torn down. He had that sense where things were disappearing and in its place were new structures, and Dad was really into the sort of emotive element of this, capturing the people in their place and their feelings. When I was younger, my sister and I, Nicola, used to go to football with my dad. He was a huge Celtic fan. He did take images from time to time, and these images are very personal to him rather than them just being a document or a record of something that's happened. He's captured this image of these faces, every single one looking passionately at their beloved team. There's that focus and concentration in every face, and you could actually sit and look at that image for some time and catch that sense of anticipation. The image of the two men and the shaft of light on either side. So there's very little information in this, except you can clearly see the two men looking into the furnace. Dad had a fascination for industry in Glasgow, an industry that was dying and changing. And the fact that these were people that worked in these industries, they worked hard, they had that diligence, they had that dedication to their jobs and pride. And I think he captured all of that. Even if he'd been filming or working on something, he had that opportunity to engage with people. And I think these particular ones in Kelvin Bridge are just beautiful. You know, the men just having a wee chat with them. Oscar was really funny. He was a very humorous man, and he could see humour in lots of things. And he would have a wee joke with someone that put people at ease really, really easily. Or he'd tweak their ear, or he'd have a big broad handshake, or he would say something that was very sensitive or empathic. Really, really striking image again of flats going up. Tenements had been pulled down, and it was really quite sad to him. And in its place where the Red Road flats, for example, were built, from this sort of low point of view or perspective, where you're almost looking up at these massive structures going up. There's a sense of geometry and almost symmetry about it, and that sense of awe and wonder about what's going to change for communities and people, given that these structures are very different from the tenements and the tenement way of life. The Castlemilk lads, now becoming a very iconic image. Oscar would have been chatting to them. I believe they had been on a run, and the boys came over and they were maybe inquisitive, you know, wondering why he had a camera, what this camera was, because it would have been a Rolleiflex, quite unusual camera, which would be down near his waist. And in that 1 second where the young man at the front just looks away, whatever he's captured there in that face is really poignant. And the wee lad just up on his tiptoes behind, resting on the shoulder, and the quieter wee guy at the back just peeking out. You know, no one is posing. They were very much themselves. And in that moment, he captured the character of each of these young men. And having met them later on with my mum and my sister, the three men were very much like the image. You know, Charlie at the front was quite bold and strong and charismatic, and had had quite a tough life growing up and had been part of the sort of gang culture in his day. And the lad in the middle was actually quite a funny man, but you had his sombre moments and difficulties in his life too. And the quieter one at the back, he's quite a gentle person as well when you meet him too. Oscar went up to the Highlands and Islands quite a bit. He was making films at that point. The Golden Road, Isle of Harris, is just a beautiful image. What was magic about Dad's work is even if there was a sense of desolation and emptiness, you still got an essence of people belonging there and people being part of something. And that sense of honesty that they've left out all their wares, hoping that somebody, you know, will maybe buy something and leave the money, that sense of trust that in some ways in society nowadays is kind of gone. The bull is kind of looking at Dad. He looks as if he's about to charge. The arched back and the arches of all the mountains in the background is really beautiful. And it's almost like he's sizing up Dad, who was a big man, 6 foot. My father would not have been wavered to either way. He would have stayed quite still to capture that shot. Dad had his cameras with him all the time. He would wait for a change of light. He had just that wee bit of patience just to wait for a few minutes more, because he knew something would change, because he had that sense of light and darkness, which is very much who he was. He could see that things would change. Oscar died very young. He was only 57, and I think there was a great sadness when he died because of his character as a person. And after he died, for us as a family, we wanted to keep that alive because his work has been kept alive through his photographs. And I think for a wee while there, it has been quite quiet too. The work was all in our homes, kind of hidden away, and it's been fantastic that there's been this resurgence now, that GCU have taken on the archive and that we've had this opportunity to have another exhibition. I hope that this work will continue to grow and people will continue to see the breadth and the depth of what he did, capturing that moment in time, capturing the city he loved.